Today we're looking at what causes banding and rolling shutter. You might be thinking, what are they? Banding is what appears as black lines across your screen, and rolling shutter is where you get crazy distortions in your pictures. In recent years, we've seen a huge boom in mirrorless cameras now, with pretty much every major manufacturer sporting a mirrorless camera of some sort on the market. And one of the big appeals of mirrorless cameras for some people is the ability to have a completely silent shutter. So to take a picture and have no moving parts inside the camera making any noise at all. Now, banding and rolling shutter can occur when using an electronic shutter or when shooting video. We don't get them when we use a mechanical shutter. And to appreciate why that is, we need to understand what is happening on the camera sensor when we're taking a picture. So a camera sensor is made up of millions of little photosites, and each of these photosites will create a pixel in a finished image. So when we take a picture, we expose the sensor to light. All of that light will be hitting these photosites, and each photosite will register how much light it collected during the exposure time. And then at the end of the exposure, the camera can read the values for each of those photosites and combine them all together to make a complete image. But then bear in mind, if we think, an average 24 megapixel camera, that's 24 million photosites that the camera is having to try and read. So that's a lot of information for it to try and process. As a result, it can't do it all in one go. So the camera will actually read the sensor information one line at a time. It does it very quickly, but there is a gap between it reading the first line and it reading the last line. Now, when using a conventional mechanical shutter, there are two shutter curtains, a front curtain and a rear curtain. Both of these will sit over the sensor. The front curtain will be closed over the sensor, the rear curtain will be behind it open. At the start of the exposure, the front curtain will move out of the way very quickly, exposing the sensor to light. Then at the end of the exposure, however long you've set the shutter for, the rear curtain will close down very quickly over the sensor, blocking it from getting any more light. At that point, the camera will then quickly read each line of the sensor one line at a time. Once it's read all the information from one line, all of those photosites are reset back to zero, so that when we're ready to take the next picture, we're starting with a fully discharged sensor. Once all the lines have been read, the sensor's reset back to zero, the camera's then ready to take its next picture. However, using an electronic shutter or shooting video has to work a little bit differently because there's no mechanical shutters to control when the light can hit the sensor. The sensor is essentially constantly exposed, which means that when we take a picture, the sensor's already capturing light. It's not recording any of it, but light is already hitting the sensor. So the photosites on the sensor already have charge collected in them. So when we take a picture, the first thing the camera has to do is go through each line and reset everything back to zero, ready to start capturing information. And then at the end of the image, it will go through and read all the information off each line. But again, while the sensor is exposed. Video is essentially this same process on a constant cycle. The camera will just read from the top line down to the bottom and then go back to the top and keep going around and around and around until you stop recording. Now, it's great from a point of view of being completely silent, so nobody knows if you're taking a picture. The problem it creates, however, is the fact that because there is a gap between the top line being read and the bottom line being read, if anything's changing within the scene whilst that's happening, it's going to create problems. And this is what causes banding and rolling shutter. So banding occurs when we shoot under certain types of artificial lighting. The reason for this is because some types of artificial light don't actually output a consistent light. They might appear to our eyes as they are a constant power of light, but in actual fact they're flickering in intensity, but so fast that we just can't perceive it with our eyes. Now, how fast they flicker will depend on where you are in the world. So if you are somewhere like here in the UK that uses the PAL system, then the lights will flicker at a rate of 50 Hz. If you live in an NTSC region, such as over in the States, then they flicker at a rate of 60 Hz. So if we have a light that's flickering in intensity whilst each line is being read, that means that some lines are going to be read whilst the lights are very intense, and some lines are going to be read whilst the lights are dim. Now, because the lights are flickering at a steady rate and the camera is reading the sensor at a pretty steady rate as well, then these lines will appear as fairly consistent lines between being light and dark. The lines will become more prominent as we increase our shutter speed, because a faster shutter speed means each individual line is exposing for less time. Whereas if you slow the shutter speed down, each line has a bit more time to capture more light, so the lines don't appear as prominent. If you set your shutter speed to the same speed or slower than the frequency of the light, then each line will expose for enough time to get a consistent amount of light, and thus you then won't get the flickering effect. Now, some of you might be wondering about the electronic front shutter curtain option on some cameras, and why does that get banding as well? For anyone who doesn't know, the electronic front shutter curtain is basically a mix between mechanical and electronic. On a mirrorless camera, or you're using live view, you're obviously already seeing the sensor exposed. So on a fully mechanical shutter, when you take the exposure, the mechanical shutter has to close down, then reopen for the pictures to start being taken, and then close down again to end the exposure and then reopen so you can see what's going on. So the shutters will move 4 times in the space of an exposure. With the electronic front shutter curtain, that first mechanical curtain doesn't move. So when you take a picture, the sensor's already exposed to light, it will start recording, and then at the end of the exposure, the second curtain will close down to cover the sensor whilst it reads the information. So you might be thinking, well, if it's down to the reading of the sensor at the end, then surely with a mechanical shutter finishing the exposure off, we shouldn't have a banding issue. The problem with this, however, is that with the mechanical shutter, that first curtain closing down allows the camera sensor to be completely discharged. So when the shutter flicks open, the sensor is ready to start reading information. With the electronic front shutter, however, you're already seeing the live view image before you're taking the picture, so the sensor's already charged. So when you take the picture, the camera then has to discharge each line very quickly. That's going to mean that under artificial light, you still get each individual line with a slightly different amount of exposure. So that's banding out the way. Rolling shutter, or the jelly effect. This tends to look like somebody's had a bit of a fit whilst using the liquify tool in Photoshop. Now, whilst it looks very different to banding, it's still caused by the same issue, which is the sensor having to read each line individually whilst the scene is being exposed. So if you imagine motion blur, for example, okay, so if an object starts here on the sensor at the beginning of the exposure and finishes here at the end of the exposure, all of the pixels in between the start and end points are going to have detected parts of the object, and you're going to get that blurring ghosting effect. It's a similar concept with rolling shutter, except if you imagine that the camera is reading from the top line to the bottom line, if anything moves in the scene whilst that effect is happening, then the object could be picked up at different parts of the scene between the start of the exposure and the end. Or if you're panning the camera whilst taking a picture, all the background that would normally appear as motion blur and a consistent streak now comes out as a weird distortion. Like I said, both of these come down to the fact that for most cameras, there is a delay between them reading the start of the sensor and the end of the sensor. All of this will be a thing of the past at some point in the future. One of the big advantages to a camera like the Sony A9 is the fact that it can read the information off the sensor so much faster than a conventional camera. So it's a lot harder to get banding and rolling shutter with a camera like the A9. But it is still possible in extreme circumstances. Ideally, at some point in the future, mainstream cameras will have a feature known as a global shutter. This is where the camera is able to switch all of the pixels on and off at the same time, so you won't get any delay between the first and last pixels being read. Unfortunately, I think that technology might be a couple of years down the line. For now, the only ways of avoiding banding and rolling shutter are a slow shutter speed. In the case of rolling shutter, don't shoot anything fast or don't move your camera really quickly. Or if you don't really need to be that quiet, use a mechanical shutter. That's it for this video. Hopefully, if you were somebody who's come across these before and weren't sure what they are, now you understand a bit better. As always, if you have any questions or queries, comment box is down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.